Weather Map API to help us explore the integrate main section of Beekeeper. When querying endpoints with OpenWeather, our API, OpenWeather expects you to have values for specific parameters, as with most APIs, meaning that we are going to add more properties to our ADM. This is the basic section of section 8. So first thing we need to do is to head over to Data Editor, and we need to create a new property called App ID. The App ID property should be a string, and then we will use the lookup weather step inside the weak weather feature to allow the user to enter the app ID. So basically, once you start the flow or the journey, it will begin by asking the user to enter their app ID value and also their location before sending the request to the OpenWeather Map API endpoint. This app ID string will be mandatory for us to authenticate ourselves with their endpoints. So once you've done that, and now that we've added the app ID property to the ADM, let's add one more property to the lookup weather step. So this property will be called units, and it will also be a string. And the description for this property is basically what type of unit we want the results to be returned in, either metric or imperial. Great, so once you've added that to the step and made it user displayed, as in don't forget, we'll need to create an account with the OpenWeather Map website. So we will navigate to this link that I've posted in the slide, and then click on sign up, and then follow the information by filling in your details. On the next screen, enter anything for the company field, and then you should arrive on the setup step. Switch to the API keys tab, and now you have access to a default 32-digit API key, which we will use, but you can also generate a new key if you wish. Also note that you will have automatically been enrolled into the free plan, meaning that for this section of the Beekeeper Training Guide, as the rest of the other sections, it will not cost us anything. Great, now let's return to Beekeeper, then select the Integrate tab. The Integrate home screen has far less information than App Builder and Data Editor, but that will soon change once we create our service provider to connect to the OpenWeather Map interface. Let's create one now. Select the Service Providers tab, then call this provider OpenWeather. After you do that, save. Switch over to the Services tab, select the drop down on the right hand side, then select our new provider. Next, we need to import our services. We'll then need to import a file called a Shadow Connect file. Now you're probably thinking, what on earth is a Shadow Connect file? Well, the file or the zip file is a collation of other files containing configuration created in Anypoint Studio, which is a MuleSoft application. Shadow Connect itself is a framework which enables the configuration and the use of a set of reusable application integration patterns. The zip file is uploaded to the data mapping tool inside this current section of Beekeeper, which enables you or us to visually create complex mappings for our Beekeeper application. For this section of the guide, I've prepared one for you to upload in this section. In the next slide, I will post a link where you can download the Weather App Shadow Connect file. And once you've downloaded it, you will need to import it, then save your progress. First, we can see that the outbound format is REST, meaning that we'll be using a REST client to communicate with OpenWeather rather than a SOAP client, for example. And then secondly, we can now see that we have a parent object called weather. Then inside that, we have a city weather object. Then inside city weather, we have weather. This weather object or block is where this part of the flow will be used with our requests and responses. Once we upload them, they will be mapped. Select the actual weather block inside the city weather object, then we can now see that the mappings are available in the right hand side. The response section will be mappable once we add our JSON response, which is also relatable to our outbound format. So next slide, I've added two files where you can download the weather request parameters JSON file and also the weather response JSON file. These are two examples where we can upload to the integrate section of App Builder so we can begin mapping our request parameters for our request to open weather map and our response, which will be a structured object where we can use the mapping tool to map from the response to our model in Beekeeper. In the meantime, let's open up the weather request parameters.json file inside your favorite editor. And as a summary, this contains a query object that will be needed to send through our service call. We aren't going to change anything in this file at this time because the values for the properties of the object will, of course, be eventually sent through the front end, or we can even do it while previewing through Beekeeper, which we're going to do anyway. This is basically just to give you a view on how the weather request parameters object will look before we implement it or upload it to Beekeeper. Alright, let's import the response object by selecting weather service again and clicking on the add button, then clicking on the load button to show the import dialog. Then click on the select file option and select the weather response.json file from your downloaded location. Once you've done that, click on import. A model has now been created in the input section, allowing us to map the potential properties, arrays, objects, and everything else to the response from JSON or XML. In this case, our chosen format for open weather will be JSON by default. Thankfully, JSON's better. To our properties, objects, arrays in our JSON model inside Beekeeper, which is our output. In the next video, we are going to map our request parameters so we can pass our app ID once we preview our journey. We will then begin data mapping. So now let's import our request parameters object. And once we've done that, we now have a request or request parameters object, and we also have a response object that we imported earlier. So with these two or these three, in theory, we can now begin mapping our properties. To begin, what we're going to do is map three properties: my location, app ID, and units to the request parameters object of Q. So Q will be mapped to my location, and again we could do that by dragging and dropping the line from the right hand side of the property to the left hand side of the other property, and we're going to map app ID that we created earlier to app ID of the request parameters object 2, and also we're going to map units to units as well. For the response object, we're going to map weather information, so weather info object dot summary dot temperature. So inside the weather object, the weather info object, then the summary object, then you'll see the temperature property. We'll then need to map that temperature property to the main.temp property of the response object. The same thing will be done with the humidity property. So inside the weather information object, then once inside that, you go into the summary object. Then once inside the summary object, you go into the humidity object, and then you will map the humidity property to the main.humidity property of the response object from the weather response.json file that we uploaded earlier. Once you've done that, we then need to create a service inside the lookup weather step. Okay, now switch back to App Builder and create a new service inside the lookup weather step. So click on the week weather feature, click on lookup weather, edit the step, and then you'll see here that we already have a business rule that we added earlier, but now we do need to add a new one. So add a new service and then name the service get the temperature. So whenever we integrate or add or use the data mapping tool, for now the service type will be an API call. So for the service type drop down, we just select API call. The service provider will be OpenWeather, and that had been defined inside the Shadow Connect file that we uploaded earlier. And then once you've selected that, the service will be weather. Then the operation will be city weather. And then the arguments which you need to enter manually will be weather. So you need to type it in and then press enter, or you press the comma to add another argument. But for now, type in weather, then press enter, and it should populate that field. And then once you're done, click save. Okay, so now that we've mapped our properties and that we've added our service, we now need to test in preview. So to do that, of course, you probably know by now, select the preview tab and then select the lookup weather step. Once you've reached a step, your properties on your step should be my location, app ID, and units. If it isn't, don't worry, we just need these three for now. For the my location property, enter your current location. So I've entered London, and then enter your app ID, which you should have copied or received from your OpenWeatherMap API keys inside your user account. And then for the units, you can enter metric, as will be based on the weather in London. And then once you do that, hit submit. And then, oh, we have an error. Okay, so the error states unknown resource ID weather, resource not specified in the model. Okay, now something is missing. Basically, it's looking for weather, as in through our weather application. We haven't created a resource or a step called weather, but we have created a step called lookup weather. So what we need to do now is change it from weather, as in the argument in the service, where we entered weather manually. We need to change it from weather to lookup weather, and it should work. Okay, so we can easily edit the step and then the service for us to change the argument in our service, but for this guide, I'm going to create a new service, get temperature and humidity. We'll import exactly the same details as the previous service, but this time I'm going to change the argument to look up weather instead of weather, as in we haven't created a weather step, so we will receive an error if the step matches something that we haven't created. Now, once we do that and hit save, we go back to preview, and then we have another error. This error states that there is a validation error. So once you receive this error, it usually means that something isn't working in the validation side. It could be from using a string with a number, or even in the integrate side where we map a string to a different type. So we probably mapped a number to an integer, for example. So let's check that. So actually, in this case, what was missing was the actual object, weather info summary, that we needed to drag in. Otherwise, it really couldn't even find the actual number property of temperature and the number property of humidity. So we do need to add that in, and then let's preview again. So we enter our address. So this time I've put London, comma, space UK, and then our app ID, which is taken from OpenWeather, and our unit type, which will be metric, which is a string. And once we submit, we now have our edit link, meaning that we have successfully mapped and tested our service integration, which is great. To do that, we can also check the state by having a look at what has come back or what's been saved in the state. So we can have a look at the updated timestamp object. Once we go into that, it will give you the current timestamp of what's currently available in the state. Inside that, we have the weather info objects, and then inside that, we've got the summary objects, and then we have the values returned from the Open Weather API inside the humidity, which is 33, and temperature at the moment for London, UK, which will be 2389. Okay, so the Open Weather API response is JSON by standard, but if we uploaded an XML file into Data Mapper inside the Integrate tab, we can easily map our properties exactly the same way. So as you can see now, how the data mapping tool is very powerful, and it will make it very easy for you to create and integrate services throughout your Beekeeper application. Okay, welcome to section 9 of the Beekeeper video training guide, and section 9 will be focusing